Turn-of-the-century Paris breathed freedom, the sense of expensive perfumes and the heavy spirit of coal dust. In the heart of this bustling metropolis, on the unassuming Rue Chabanais, behind thick velvet curtains, lay an establishment whispered about in the corridors of European palaces, but never mentioned in official newspapers. Here, in luxurious interiors reminiscent sometimes of Pompeian villas, sometimes of Japanese palaces, time stood still. But the main secret of this place, its engineering marvel and legend, was not the interior nor the exquisite wines, but a strange piece of furniture standing in the personal apartments of the most important guest. It was a chair, not just a place for rest, but a complex mechanism, custom-made, with precisely calculated angles, soft armrests, and special supports. A construction designed to solve a delicate problem: how to combine an insatiable thirst for physical intimacy with the bulky, heavy body of a man unaccustomed to denying himself food or pleasures. The owner of this unique throne of delights, known as the Love Chair, was none other than the heir to the British throne, the future King Edward VII, or, as he was affectionately and sometimes mockingly called within the family and society, Bertie. This image, a bulky, bearded man squeezed into the corset of a uniform, yet yearning for the lightness of being, became the key to understanding an entire era. To understand how the future monarch of the world's greatest empire became the main client of a Parisian house of ill repute, one must rewind time to where his personal drama began, hidden behind the gold of Buckingham Palace. Bertie's story is a classic example of how excessive pressure creates a monstrously powerful backlash. His parents, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, dreamed of creating an ideal monarch. Albert, a man of iron discipline and German pedantry, devised an educational program for his son that could drive an adult scholar mad, let alone a small boy. From early morning until late evening, the young prince's life was scheduled down to the minute. Languages, history, law, military affairs, natural sciences. No games, no peers, no children's laughter. Albert wanted to raise a replica of himself, a strict, moral, intellectual ruler. But nature played a cruel trick. Bertie was born the complete opposite of his father. He was a lively, emotional, tactile child who struggled with studies, and strict rules only made him long for freedom. The tighter the spring of parental control was compressed, the more powerful the explosion. The first serious incident that determined Bertie's fate occurred in a military camp in Ireland, where the 19-year-old prince was sent for service. Officers, wishing to entertain the bored heir, secretly brought actress Nellie Clifton into his tent. For Bertie, this was the first taste of real life, not life from books. But when rumors reached the palace, disaster struck. Prince Albert, already ill, went to his son for a difficult conversation in the pouring rain. Soon after this visit, Albert died. Queen Victoria, until the end of her days, and she was to reign for almost 40 more years, blamed Bertie and his debauchery for the death of her beloved husband. This maternal coldness, which grew into estrangement, created an enormous void within the heir, which he began to fill with frantic energy. Isolated from state affairs, his mother strictly forbade him even to glance at secret government documents, the Prince of Wales created his own kingdom. A kingdom of night, luxury, and endless festivity. He became the architect of the lifestyle that would later be called Edwardian. This was an era when hedonism was elevated to an art form. Bertie didn't just love life, he devoured it. His appetite was legendary. A 12-course dinner was the norm, with substantial snacks between meals. He smoked 12 huge cigars and over 20 cigarettes daily. But his main passion, of course, was women. The list of his favorites reads like an encyclopedia of European high society and bohemian life in the second half of the 19th century. He made no distinction between aristocrats and courtesans. Only beauty, wit, and the ability to keep secrets were valued. One of the brightest stars in this firmament was Lily Langtry, dubbed the __1_. A woman of incredible beauty, she became the first officially recognized mistress whom the prince was not ashamed to display to society. Their relationship was a kind of challenge to Victorian morality, but a challenge that society accepted with tacit consent. For Bertie set the tone. He introduced the fashion for trips to Biarritz and the French Riviera. He popularized tweed and, according to legend, it was he who invented turning up trousers, creating cuffs, simply because the streets were muddy. However, beneath the external brilliance lay a complex psychological game. Bertie was married to Princess Alexandra of Denmark, a woman of astonishing beauty and angelic patience. She knew about her husband's escapades, endured his constant absences, and even, according to rumors, maintained friendly relations with some of his paramours. This strange triangle, or rather polygon, was based on an unspoken agreement. Bertie always returned home, observed external decorum, and treated his wife with deep, albeit peculiar, respect. But his true life bubbled outside the family hearth. It was in Paris, a city where morality was not shackles but merely a light veil, that Bertie truly felt at home. The brothel Le Chabanais became his unofficial residence. This establishment was the height of Belle Époque luxury. Here, in a room decorated in Indian style, stood the famous copper bathtub, adorned with a swan figure with a woman's head. There is a legend that Bertie loved to take champagne baths with his companions, but of course, the main artifact remained that very chair. The engineering thought invested in the creation of this seat of love deserves special attention, though it causes embarrassment among Puritans. Over the years, the prince had grown considerably in girth. His stomach, which he jokingly called tam-tam, became a serious obstacle to traditional forms of intimacy. French craftsmen created a structure that allowed the prince and his partner, and sometimes two, to find comfortable positions that did not require excessive physical exertion from the heir to the throne. This chair was not just furniture for pleasure, it was a symbol of the power of technology over physiology, a symbol that for a person with unlimited resources, there are no insoluble problems. It stood as a monument to human desire that refuses to fade even under the weight of years and excess weight. But to reduce Bertie's personality solely to carnal pleasures would be a huge historical error. This is the main paradox of his figure. A man who spent nights in the arms of courtesans would transform into a shrewd diplomat by day. It was his sociability, his ability to find common ground with anyone, from the actress Sarah Bernhardt to Kaiser Wilhelm, that became his main political capital. While Queen Victoria remained secluded in her castles, Bertie traveled. He was the face of the British monarchy abroad. He visited North America, where he danced with presidents' wives and hunted in the prairies. He embarked on a grand tour of India, which strengthened the colony's ties with the mother country. People loved him for being a living, understandable, sinful human being, not an unattainable idol. Among his favorites were women who influenced not only his mood, but also his views. Sarah Bernhardt, the great actress, taught him to appreciate the power of art and public gesture. and in his later years, Alice Keppel became his chief comforter. This woman possessed a unique gift. She knew how to calm the hot-tempered and aging king, dispel his melancholy, and even offer sound political advice, all while remaining in the shadows. Their bond was so strong that even Queen Alexandra, with a heavy heart, allowed Alice to be at the dying king's bedside, understanding that only she could ease his suffering. Edward's internal conflict lay in eternal waiting. He only became king at the age of 59 in 1901. For almost 6 decades, he was the prince in waiting. This waiting could have broken anyone, turned them into a cynic or a misanthrope. But Bertie managed to transform his idleness into a style. When he ascended the throne, many feared disaster. Whispers circulated that the old debauchee would ruin the empire. However, a miracle of transformation occurred. Shedding the burden of waiting and finally gaining real responsibility, the love machine of the Victorian era turned into one of the most effective monarchs in British history. His reign lasted only 9 years, but this period, known as the Edwardian era, became the golden sunset of old Europe. Edward VII proved to be a brilliant peacemaker. Using his personal connections, his charm, and his knowledge of the European mentality, he became the architect of the Entente Cordiale. His visit to Paris in 1903 became a legend of diplomacy. The French met him coldly, remembering colonial disputes. But Bertie, addressing the crowd in impeccable French, visiting theaters and racetracks, melted the ice. He spoke of France as his second homeland, and this was not a lie. Paris, which had seen his secret visits to Le Chabanais, now welcomed him as a great statesman. It was this alliance between Britain and France that became the foundation of security on the eve of the approaching global storm. The ideological conflict of his life was the clash of old aristocratic duty and the new bourgeois right to happiness. Edward was a new type of monarch. He understood that in the 20th century, a king must be visible. He must be part of society, not a sacred figure behind high walls. He opened the monarchy to wealthy industrialists, American heiresses, and Jewish bankers, breaking down centuries-old caste barriers. His court was brilliant, noisy, and cosmopolitan. He showed that one could enjoy life and still serve the country. His hedonism, paradoxically, made him more human in the eyes of his subjects. They forgave him his weaknesses because they saw their own desires in them. The culmination of his life came when his health, undermined by decades of excess, began to rapidly decline. His bronchitis, exacerbated by endless smoking, escalated into serious attacks. But even when ill, he did not abandon state affairs and, of course, his habits. In his last days in May 1910, he continued to work with documents, sitting in his armchair, no longer that Parisian one, but his working chair in Buckingham Palace. When his favorite horse won a race and he was informed of it, he whispered his last words, "I am very glad." This was Bertie all over, a man who, until his last breath, valued the joy of the moment, be it a victory at the races, the taste of good wine, or the smile of a beautiful woman. The passing of Edward VII marked the end of an entire era. Soon after his demise, the old Europe he so loved and tried to cement with his personal ties collapsed into the meat grinder of the First World War. His nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm, and his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, did not possess the wisdom and zest for life that allowed Edward to smooth over rough edges. The death of Uncle Europe, as he was called, became a harbinger of the decline of monarchies. But what became of that very armchair? After the king's death, and the closure of brothels in France in the mid-20th century, the traces of many interior items were lost. However, the legendary quote, "2" did not disappear. It was bought at auction, and today is a museum exhibit, a strange and silent witness to the secret life of a great man. Looking at its whimsical design, upholstered in time-worn fabric, we see not just a device for debauchery. We see an artifact of a time when the private lives of kings were as grand as their public role. The lessons of Edward VII's life are relevant today. He showed that perfect people do not exist, and even on the throne sits a man of flesh and blood. His story teaches us that suppressing desires leads to an explosion, and accepting one's nature can be a source of strength. His diplomacy, built on personal contact and the ability to enjoy life with an opponent, is what modern politicians often lack. He proved that one can be a serious statesman without turning into a dry statue. Ultimately, Edward's story is a story of a thirst for life, of how a boy who was prepared to be an ethereal ideal became the most earthly of kings. And perhaps it was this earthly nature, this passion for women, food, and comfort that allowed him to so subtly feel the pulse of time and keep the world from catastrophe for exactly as long as his own heart, weary from excesses, beat. The chair in the Parisian brothel and the throne in Westminster Abbey are two sides of the same coin, two poles between which flowed the life of a man who managed to make pleasure a part of his royal work. More than 100 years have passed since then. The world has changed beyond recognition, but the legend of the Playboy King, the Diplomat King, and his amazing chair continues to live, reminding us that history is made not only on battlefields and in meeting rooms, but also behind closed bedroom doors, to the clinking of glasses and the whisper of love confessions. And who knows, perhaps if there were more such lovers of life as Bertie, the history of the 20th century would have been a little less bloody and a little happier. Tracing Edward's path, we see an amazing transformation in the perception of vice and virtue. In the Victorian era, his behavior was considered scandalous, almost criminal in the eyes of strict moralists. Today, however, we look at it with irony and even sympathy. His weaknesses made him human. He did not hide behind the mask of a saint like many of his contemporaries. His love chair is not just a monument to debauchery, it is a monument to honesty with oneself. He knew who he was, knew his needs, and was not afraid to fulfill them, even if it required complex engineering solutions. It's interesting to trace how his relationships with women influenced the political climate. Alice Keppel, the king's last love, was a kind of unofficial minister. Through her, politicians conveyed delicate requests to the king, knowing that in the soft atmosphere of the boudoir, Bertie would be more amenable than in the official cabinet. This was pillow diplomacy in the highest sense of the word. Women didn't just entertain him, they created the emotional airbag that was necessary for a man carrying the burden of a vast empire on his shoulders. Without this release, without these escapes to Paris, without nocturnal conversations and champagne, he probably would not have withstood the tension and would have broken, like many monarchs before and after him. In this context, the very concept of a quote, one acquires a different, deeper meaning. This was not just a mechanical pursuit of pleasure. It was a machine for converting stress into vital energy. Edward used pleasures as fuel. The more difficult state affairs became, the more sophisticated his entertainments grew. This was a balance found intuitively. The scales, on one side of which lay the crown of the British Empire, and on the other, Parisian courtesans, constantly swayed but never overturned. Edward held them in balance with his powerful hand. When we delve into the details of his daily life, the scale of preparation is striking. Each of his visits to Paris was a special operation. Agents checked routes in advance, booked boxes in theaters, and made arrangements with chefs. Quote, "Two prepared for the arrival of the high guest as for a state visit. Rumors say that there was a separate entrance for the king and a system of signals so that he would not cross paths with other visitors. This was a double life elevated to the absolute. But what is surprising is that the French, known for their anti-monarchism, adored him. For them, he was, quote, 3. They saw in him a kindred spirit, a man who understood the art of living, l'art de vivre. This connection with France played a decisive role when Europe began to split into warring camps. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Edward's nephew, hated his uncle precisely for this, for his lightness, for his charm, for the fact that Bertie was loved in Paris while Wilhelm was feared and despised. The Kaiser's personal dislike and envy of the old peacock, as he called Edward, became one of the psychological factors pushing Germany towards war. Wilhelm wanted to prove that his Iron Germany was stronger than Edward's _6_ Britain. But history showed that Edward's flexibility and humanity created stronger alliances than the rattling of weapons. In his last years, Edward became a symbol of stability. People looked at his corpulent figure, his unchanging cigar, his elegant suits, and believed that as long as this man was on the throne, all would be well with the world. He exuded the confidence and calmness of a well-fed lion. His death was a shock precisely because that confidence departed with him. The largest number of monarchs in history gathered at his funeral. 9 kings rode on horseback behind his coffin. It was the last parade of old Europe. And among the mourners were Alice Keppel and Queen Alexandra, and even, invisibly, the shadows of those women from the Parisian house on Chabanais Street. They all bid farewell to a man who knew how to love life in all its manifestations. Today, when we look at black and white photographs of that time, Edward VII often looks comical. Too fat, too bearded, too many orders. But behind this appearance lies the drama of a man who fought all his life with the shadow of an ideal father and a cold mother, and won, creating himself. He did not become a copy of Albert. He became Bertie, unique and inimitable. And that very chair is not evidence of depravity, but a trophy in this struggle for the right to be oneself. The right to one's desires, to one's body, to one's happiness, even if you wear a crown that obliges you to be a superhuman. Reflecting on Edward's legacy, we understand that his life is a lesson in empathy. He knew how to listen. He was interested in people, whether it was a minister, a jockey at the races, or a girl from _0_. For him, they were all living people with their own stories. It was this quality, not strategic genius, that made him a great diplomat. He built bridges between countries just as he built relationships with people, through personal contact, through shared pleasures, through understanding human weaknesses. In a world where politics often turns into a dry game of numbers and abstractions, Edward's example reminds us that at the center of everything, there is always a human being. And even now, more than a century later, the story of the king and his chair brings a smile. But it's not a sneer. It's a smile of understanding. We recognize ourselves in him, our weaknesses, our desires, our striving to find a piece of happiness in this complex world. Edward VII was no saint, and thank goodness for that. Saints rarely make good rulers for sinful people, but Bertie was one of us. He was a king who descended from heaven to earth, sat in his specially constructed chair, lit a cigar, and told the world, "Let's just live in peace and have fun." And while he was alive, the world really tried to follow that advice. Perhaps this is his main, albeit unwritten, political testament. A reminder that life is too short for wars, but always long enough for love and a good dinner. It is symbolic that the building of Le Chabanais itself is now an ordinary residential building. The luxurious interiors were sold off, the secret passages bricked up. Only memorial plaques and pages of historical chronicles recall its former grandeur. But the spirit of that time, the spirit of freedom and adventure that the Prince of Wales brought there, has remained in culture. It has dissolved into films, books, and the very atmosphere of Paris. The story of Edward and his chair has become part of urban folklore, turning into a myth. And myths, as we know, live longer than facts. And in this myth, the king always remains young at heart, full of strength and desires, an eternal prisoner and master of his passions, seated on his unique throne at the center of the universe of pleasures that he created for himself, despite all the prohibitions and rules of his prim era. Analyzing the technical side of the matter, one cannot help but admire the skill of the craftsmen of that era. Creating a structure that could withstand significant loads, be ergonomic, and at the same time aesthetically fit into a luxurious interior was no trivial task. It was a kind of engineering of pleasure. The surviving descriptions and drawings of such devices speak of a deep understanding of anatomy and mechanics. For Edward, who was always interested in technical innovations, he was one of the first monarchs to buy a car and appreciate the telephone, this chair was also a kind of gadget, an advanced device of its time. He loved progress in all its manifestations, even in such intimate ones. This is another facet of his personality: openness to new things, fearlessness in experimentation, be it foreign policy or personal life. Thus, the story of Edward VII is a complex tapestry woven from contradictions. Monarch and playboy, diplomat and hedonist, loving husband and tireless lover. All these hypostases coexisted in one person, not hindering but complementing each other. And perhaps it is precisely because of this integrity, this ability to accept himself in his entirety, that he remained in history not as a fleeting figure, but as a symbol of an entire era, an era when the sun never set on the British Empire, and in Paris, on Chabanais Street, the light in the windows of the royal apartments never went out. Edward's life is a hymn to vitality, a triumph of life over grayness and boredom, proof that even under the weight of a crown, one can and should remain a living person. And as long as we remember this story, as long as we are able to be surprised and smile at the mention of the love chair, a part of that amazing era continues to live within us.